The small town of Ashefield woke slowly with the dawn, as though the sun itself had to coax life into its streets. The roads were nearly empty, save for the quiet hum of a milk truck and the faint whistle of a postman on his morning route. Inside the only diner on Main Street, the smell of bacon and eggs carried through the air, mixing with the soft crackle of the jukebox that had seen better days. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen, and perhaps that was why the townspeople loved it so much. At his usual booth by the window sat Earl Whitman. He was 81 years old, though the weight of his years showed less in his body and more in his eyes. Blue, sharp, and unyielding, those eyes had seen more than most men could ever imagine. His hands trembled as he lifted his coffee cup, but his posture remained straight, his shoulders squared with quiet dignity. To the casual observer he might have looked like just another old man waiting for the day to pass. But anyone who dared to look closely enough would have recognized something more, an aura of resilience, a kind of unshaken strength that cannot be taught, only earned. The regulars knew him, of course. They nodded politely in his direction, whispering "Morning, Earl," as they shuffled past. He always gave them a faint smile, never too much, never too little. He wasn't one for unnecessary chatter. To them he was simply the man who drank black coffee and ate dry toast every morning. But Earl carried a history within him, a history that none of them could truly grasp. A history of trenches filled with mud and fear, of brothers who never came home, of battles that tested not only muscle but the human spirit. That morning felt no different than any other. The clink of dishes, the chatter of waitresses, and the occasional ring of the front bell painted a familiar backdrop. Earl buttered his toast with slow, steady hands, lost in thought. To him these quiet mornings were a gift. A reminder that after a lifetime of storms, there could still be peace, however fragile. But storms have a way of returning when least expected. The bell above the diner door rang and instantly the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the cheerful ding that usually marked the arrival of a neighbor or a family with children. No, this sound carried with it a weight, like a warning that the air itself understood. The man who walked in didn't belong in Ashefield's diner. His very presence cut against the grain of the room. He was in his mid-30s with a leather jacket hanging loose over his shoulders, his stride sharp and deliberate. His boots struck the tiled floor with loud echoes, and his smirk carried the kind of arrogance that dares others to look away. His name, though unspoken in that moment, was Trevor Cole. Trevor didn't ask for a seat. He slammed himself into a booth, stretching his arms wide like he owned the place. His voice barked across the room as he shouted for coffee. The waitress, barely 20, hurried forward, her hands trembling slightly as she poured his cup. Trevor sneered, eyeing the steaming mug with disdain. "Mud water," he spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is this all you people can make?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Customers averted their eyes, staring down at their plates, pretending not to hear. But the words had cut through them all the same. The waitress's face flushed, her lips quivering as she tried to manage a smile. Earl watched quietly, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a man who invited trouble, but disrespect, especially to someone undeserving of it, had always stirred something in him. Setting down his knife, he lifted his gaze and spoke in a voice calm but firm. "Young man," he said, "no reason to talk to her that way. She's just doing her job." The diner froze. Every pair of eyes darted between the old veteran and the younger man, holding their breath. Trevor's smirk deepened, twisting cruelly as he turned toward Earl. His boots scraped against the floor as he stood, moving slowly, deliberately, savoring each step until he loomed over the old man's booth. "What did you just say, old man?" Earl's face remained calm, his eyes steady. "I said be kind. It doesn't cost you anything." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The air was so thick it could have snapped. Then, without warning, Trevor's hand lashed out. A sharp crack split the room as his palm struck Earl's cheek. The sound echoed, bouncing off the diner walls, silencing even the jukebox in the corner. Gasps filled the air, but no one moved. Plates stilled, forks hovered midair, and the waitress clapped a hand over her mouth. Earl's head turned slightly with the force of the slap, but his eyes never left Trevor's. There was no fear, no rage, only calm, unshaken dignity. Trevor chuckled darkly. "That's what kindness gets you." He turned his head, scanning the room, daring anyone to oppose him. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire diner shrank back into its silence, consumed by the weight of helplessness and shame. Earl dabbed the corner of his mouth with a napkin, his voice quiet but steady. "You don't know what battles really are, son." Trevor strutted back to his booth, satisfied with his display. He sipped his coffee like a king reclaiming a throne, arrogance oozing from his smirk. The room remained frozen, but the silence wasn't only about fear of Trevor, it was about their own shame. Shame for doing nothing, shame for letting a frail old man take a blow without a word of defense. Earl sat quietly, shoulders squared, as if the weight of his memories was heavier than the slap he had just endured. He remembered war. He remembered sacrifice. He remembered brothers who had laid down their lives for the man beside them. Compared to that, this moment was nothing. Yet what struck him hardest was the silence. For Earl knew silence is often heavier than violence. But even as the diner held its breath, the world outside was shifting. Far off in the distance, faint and almost forgotten beneath the chatter of engines and laughter, a sound began to rise. The low growl of motorcycles carried on the wind. And the storm had only just begun. The slap lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Trevor leaned back in his booth, sipping his coffee with smug satisfaction, convinced he had conquered the room. The waitress wiped at her tears, her hands trembling as she poured another round of coffee for a couple in the corner. No one looked at her, no one dared. Their shame was heavy enough without her eyes finding theirs. Earl's cheek bore the faint red imprint of Trevor's hand, but the old veteran sat upright, his eyes clear, his voice steady in the silence. He had taken hits before, hits far worse than this. What pierced him wasn't the sting of flesh meeting flesh but the sight of his neighbors shrinking back, their heads bowed, their courage smothered by fear. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the mug. To anyone else it seemed an ordinary sound, but inside Earl's mind, it echoed against memories that refused to die. He remembered crouching in muddy trenches at 19, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. He remembered carrying brothers whose bodies were broken by shrapnel, whispering prayers that never left his lips. And above all, he remembered the lesson that had kept him alive. True strength wasn't in fists or weapons. It was in standing tall when the world tried to break you. Trevor slammed his cup down suddenly, pulling everyone back into the moment. "See," he barked, his grin cutting across the room. "Even the old fossil knows his place." His laugh was loud, ugly, scraping at the nerves of everyone present. But Earl didn't react. He folded his napkin neatly, placing it beside his untouched toast. His silence was not surrender, it was defiance in its purest form. At a booth near the back, a young man in his 20s shifted uncomfortably. His baseball cap was pulled low over his brow, as if he could hide behind its shadow. He clenched his fists under the table, wanting to stand, to say something, anything, but fear wrapped chains around his chest. He looked at Earl, at the deep lines carved into his face, and shame filled him. How could an old man show such strength when he, young and able-bodied, sat frozen? The waitress caught Earl's eye, her lips trembling as though she wanted to apologize. Earl gave her the smallest nod, soft but firm. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. Fear was a heavy thing. It silenced the loudest voices, it pinned men to their seats, it suffocated courage before it could take shape. Earl had seen it before, on battlefields, in bunkers, in the eyes of soldiers who wanted to fight but couldn't bring themselves to move. Still, that nod was enough. The young man in the baseball cap felt it ignite something faint inside him. A spark, not yet a flame but alive. Trevor noticed none of this. He leaned back, arms spread wide like a king surveying his kingdom. His eyes scanned the room, searching for another target. Finally they landed on the young man in the cap. "What about you, kid?" Trevor sneered. "Want to play hero? Stand up and I'll knock you down twice as hard." The young man froze. His throat went dry. He shook his head quickly, staring down at the table. Trevor's laughter exploded again, filling the diner, drowning out the jukebox. "Thought so. This is my place now." Earl took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitterness ground him. His voice was low but carried across the room. "Respect is the only strength that lasts." Trevor's laughter faltered just slightly. He turned back, his eyes narrowing. "Respect? That's weakness. Look around you, old man. Nobody here respects you enough to stand up." But Earl didn't flinch. "Respect isn't about who stands up for me. It's about how I stand when everyone else stays seated." The words hung heavy in the room. For a moment even Trevor couldn't reply. Outside, faint at first, came the low rumble of an engine. It was so distant that few noticed it, blending with the whisper of the wind and the hum of the street. But Earl heard it. His veteran's ear was trained to catch small changes in the air, in the rhythm of the world. His hand trembled slightly on the coffee cup, not from fear but from recognition. That sound belonged to his son, Caleb. It had been weeks since Earl had last seen him. Caleb worked long hours as a mechanic in the city, grease under his nails and stubbornness in his bones. He wasn't perfect, no man was, but he had loyalty running deep through him, loyalty Earl had nurtured with every lesson of dignity, respect, and restraint. Earl had always worried that Caleb's fire might burn too bright, that it might consume him before he learned control. But he had also known that when Caleb's fire was directed toward protecting those he loved, nothing could stop him. The sound grew louder. Not one engine now but several. Deep, rolling, powerful. The kind of sound that made the ground vibrate and the glass windows shiver in their frames. The diners began to notice. Heads turned toward the door, nervous whispers rising in the stillness. Trevor leaned forward, his smirk fading for the first time. His boot tapped against the tile, not with arrogance but with unease. Earl whispered his son's name under his breath, a prayer more than a hope. Gulp. The storm was coming. The faint roar outside grew louder, swelling like thunder rolling across an empty plain. Soon it was no longer a whisper but a storm, a growl of engines that rattled the diner's windows. The bell above the door chimed softly as if trembling in anticipation. Trevor straightened in his booth, his smirk thinning. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. He looked toward the door, masking his unease with bravado, but the shake in his hand as he lifted his cup betrayed him. The door swung open and the storm entered. Leather jackets, heavy boots, and the weight of men who carried themselves with unshakable authority filled the diner in a single stride. The air changed instantly, every customer inhaled at once, their breaths caught between fear and awe. At their center was Caleb Whitman, Earl's son. Broad-shouldered, grease still smudged beneath his fingernails, Caleb walked with the steady calm of a man who didn't need to prove himself. His eyes scanned the room, sharp and unyielding, until they found his father. The red mark on Earl's cheek burned into his vision, and something deep inside him snapped. His jaw clenched, his fists tightened, and his stride quickened. The Hell's Angels flanked him, their patches bold, their silence louder than any words. They weren't here to fill the room with noise. They were here to fill it with presence. Trevor leaned back in his seat, suddenly smaller in the shadow of so many. His fingers tapped nervously on the tabletop. The swagger that had owned the diner minutes ago slipped away like sand through his hands. Caleb crossed the room without hesitation. Every boot step echoed like a drumbeat, steady, unrelenting. He reached his father's booth and dropped to one knee beside him. "Dad," Caleb whispered, his voice low, rough with emotion. "Who did this?" Earl's gaze met his son's. Calm, unbroken, though his cheek still bore the sting of Trevor's slap. "It's all right, Caleb. Let it be." But Caleb's eyes were fire. He turned his head, locking onto Trevor. The Hell's Angels shifted behind him, silent shadows of loyalty and fury. Their weight filled the diner, pressing against Trevor's chest, squeezing the arrogance from him. Caleb rose slowly, his shoulders broad, his stance solid. His voice carried across the room like steel wrapped in thunder. "Stand up." The words weren't loud, but they were heavier than any shout. The diner fell silent, so silent even the ticking of the old clock seemed deafening. The young man in the baseball cap leaned forward, unable to breathe. The waitress gripped her coffee pot so tightly her knuckles went white. Every customer's gaze shifted from Caleb to Trevor, waiting. Trevor's chest rose and fell. He laughed once, sharp and nervous, trying to reclaim his lost swagger. "What, you think you can scare me? Just because you've got your little gang with you?" Caleb shook his head slowly, his eyes locked on Trevor. "I don't need them to deal with you." The Hell's Angels didn't move, didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than thunder, their presence a wall Trevor couldn't climb. Trevor hesitated. Pride forced him to rise, though his legs shook beneath him. He stood tall, or tried to, but his shoulders betrayed him, hunched slightly, his breath uneven. Caleb took a step closer, closing the space between them. He didn't swing, didn't shove, didn't lash out. He simply stood, his presence heavier than fists, his gaze unrelenting. "You think it makes you strong," Caleb said, his voice steady, "to hit an old man?" Trevor's lips curled into a smirk, but it wavered. He had it coming. "That's my father." The words dropped like a hammer. Trevor flinched, just slightly but enough for everyone to see. The Hell's Angels leaned forward in unison, their jackets creasing, their boots shifting against the floor. Trevor's eyes darted toward them, then back to Caleb. For the first time that morning he looked cornered. But before Caleb could speak again, Earl's hand reached out, firm and steady, gripping his son's wrist. "Don't," Earl said, his voice low but commanding. Caleb's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling as rage battled with restraint. His father's voice carried the weight of decades, the authority of a man who had endured more than Trevor could ever comprehend. "This isn't your fight," Earl continued softly. "It's his burden, not yours." Trevor smirked, sensing an opening. "That's right. Listen to your daddy." But Earl's eyes snapped toward him, sharp and unyielding. His words sliced through the room. "You mistake restraint for weakness. That's your greatest blindness." The smirk slipped from Trevor's face. The waitress, trembling still, found her voice. "Why don't you just leave?" Trevor turned toward her, his glare sharp, but her courage didn't falter this time. She stood taller, her eyes steady despite the tremor in her hands. And something shifted. The young man in the baseball cap straightened, his shoulders firm. The couple in the corner lifted their chins, meeting Trevor's gaze instead of lowering their own. One by one the room began to rise, not with fists but with dignity. Respect spread like a tide, filling the diner with something Trevor had no weapon against. He wasn't facing one old man anymore. He wasn't even facing a gang of bikers. He was facing a room full of people who had remembered how to stand. Trevor's confidence cracked. His fists curled, his breath came faster, but the control he had clung to was gone. His kingdom had fallen not to violence but to respect. And for the first time since he'd entered that diner, Trevor Cole knew fear. Trevor's bravado slipped like water through his fingers. His breathing was shallow, his eyes darting from face to face as the walls seemed to close in. Where moments ago he had commanded silence through fear, now silence pressed against him with judgment. He tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow, brittle, a desperate attempt to cling to control that was already gone. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, his words thin, stripped of power. Earl's voice cut through the air, calm but commanding, the kind of voice that carried authority without needing to rise. "It means everything. It means your fists don't rule here. Respect does." The room stilled once more, not in fear this time, but in reverence. Every eye turned to Earl, seeing not a frail old man, but a pillar unbroken, stronger than any blow Trevor could deliver. Trevor's shoulders sagged. His boots scraped the tile as he shuffled toward the door. The bell above it jingled softly when he pushed it open, but the sound was weak, stripped of its usual cheer. Outside, the thunder of motorcycles waited, their engines growling like a wall of judgment. Trevor didn't look back. He couldn't. The diner exhaled all at once, a collective release of breath that seemed to lift the very weight from the walls. The waitress lowered her trembling hands, finally steady. The young man in the baseball cap stood taller, his shame dissolving into something new, courage. Customers glanced at one another, their eyes no longer cast down but meeting with quiet acknowledgement. Caleb stood at his father's side, fists still tense, fire still burning in his chest. His voice was rough, heavy with guilt. "I should have." Earl cut him off with a firm hand on his wrist. "No, son. You did exactly what you needed to. You stood. Sometimes standing doesn't mean striking. Sometimes it means holding back." Caleb's jaw trembled. He had always believed strength meant action, that fists were the answer when words failed. But looking at his father, weathered yet unbroken, he felt something shift deep within him. The Hells Angels, men known across towns for toughness and fire, sat quietly in their booths, watching. Their silence carried respect, not just for Caleb but for Earl, the man who had taught strength without violence. Even they, men who lived by code and loyalty, recognized the greater power of restraint. The young man in the baseball cap walked to Earl's booth. His voice shook but his eyes were steady. "Thank you, sir." Earl gave him a nod, small but powerful. Courage was contagious and it had spread. The diner slowly returned to life. Plates clinked again, conversations rose like timid seedlings breaking soil. The jukebox hummed softly as though relieved to fill the silence with something lighter. The waitress poured a fresh cup of coffee for Earl, her hands steady now. "On the house?" she said with a faint smile. Earl lifted the cup carefully, savoring its warmth. Caleb sat across from him, eyes fixed on his father with something new, not just love but reverence. For the first time he understood that dignity wasn't a shield for the weak. It was the sword of the strong. The sun tilted higher, spilling through the diner windows, bathing the room in light. The Hells Angels filled the booths around Caleb, not rowdy or loud but present, like guardians at ease. Their laughter was low, respectful. Earl placed his weathered hand on Caleb's. His voice was soft but carried the weight of finality. "Caleb, a man's true strength isn't measured by how hard he hits. It's measured by what he protects. Promise me when the world pushes you, don't just push back. Stand taller. That's how you honor me." Caleb swallowed hard, his chest tight, but he nodded. "I promise, Dad." The jukebox played a slow tune, almost hymn-like, as if the walls themselves wanted to honor the vow. When Earl finally stood, the diner rose with him, not out of obligation but out of respect. He tipped his cap to the waitress, offered a smile to the young man in the baseball cap, and patted his son's shoulder. Together they walked to the door. The Hells Angels followed behind Caleb, silent, unified, their presence heavy but protective. As the door opened, sunlight spilled across the floor, brighter than before. The customers sat in reflection, not out of fear but reverence. They had witnessed something rare, dignity defeating arrogance, restraint defeating violence. Outside, motorcycles rumbled like an anthem. Earl lifted his face to the breeze, closed his eyes, and whispered words only the wind could hear. Respect always wins. Caleb looked at him then, not as a fragile old man, but as the strongest man he had ever known. The road stretched ahead, endless and alive. And together, father and son walked into the light, one carrying fire, the other carrying wisdom, both bound by a truth the world too often forgets. In a world that confuses cruelty with power, Ashefield's diner would never forget that day. For on that morning, strength wasn't measured in fists but in dignity. And dignity, as Earl Whitman proved, was unbreakable.